should be here. We have assembled some brilliant minds today, some thinkers on Africa and the globe, and we have some wonderful panel discussions for you today. And so before we begin, we want to give thanks to the Most Highest, our ancestors, those who have come before us, those who have already left, and those who are to come. I want to take the time to thank all of our sponsors. We will do more of that throughout the day. But first, we're going to begin with a wonderful presentation. Just sit back and watch before we go and introduce our panelists for our first panel discussion. So thank you again for coming, and let's watch Africa grow.
Voice of America reaches more than 236 million people every week. On television and radio, on the web, and on mobile, in more than 40 languages. In Africa, VOA is on the ground with around-the-clock news and original reporting you'll not see anywhere else.
We traveled with a military convoy, 12 trucks with anti-aircraft guns and dozens of troops.
In Hausa, VOA is a leader in exposing the terror of Boko Haram, uncovering secret video showing the cruelty of life under Muslim extremism, and countering with original stories of 4 women standing up to that violence.
It's one thing to rebuild homes and to rebuild hospitals and to rebuild schools. The most important thing is to rebuild people.
VOA Somali has daily news on Facebook Live and a weekly show on Somali national television with U.S., international, and regional reporting, correspondence inside Somalia, and special programming linking Mogadishu with diaspora in the United States. For Francophone Africa, Washington Forum delivers in-depth reporting, analysis, and interviews, simulcast online, on radio, and on more than 20 television affiliates across the continent. VOA Washington correspondent reports run on local newscasts of broadcast partners in French, Portuguese, and Swahili. Daily Facebook Live programs in Portuguese on Washington After Hours present newsmaker interviews and analysis, along with the latest entertainment and sports. VOA reaches more than 5 million Ethiopians every week in Afan Oromo, in Tigrinya, and in Amharic, with newsmaker interviews and youth programming, with personal stories from the diaspora, and on-the-scene reporting from political demonstrations at home and protests abroad. In English, Africa 54 broadcasts daily news and analysis on more than 50 television affiliates, alongside the long-running current affairs program, Straight Talk with Shaka Sali. On radio, Africa News Tonight and South Sudan in Focus keep audiences up to date ahead of the popular youth program Up Front, original artist interviews on Music Time in Africa, and all the continent's sports on the sunny side of sports. In Mali, VOA broadcasts in Bambara on FM stations in Bamako, Gao, and Timbuktu, with news on Mali Kora, political debate on Anbafo, and entertainment in Music Time in Bambara. VOA Swahili's Duniani Leo delivers The World Today with correspondents in Tanzania, Kenya, and Congo, backed by Washington reporting on U.S. politics, business, and technology. In Kinyarwanda and Kirundi, VOA is one of the only sources of reliable news in languages spoken best by the most people, with coverage from political capitals and refugee camps and From the Provinces programs, reaching nearly 2/3 of adults in Burundi every week. VOA broadcast history from Zimbabwe with round-the-clock coverage of the fall of Robert Mugabe, engaging Shona and Ndebele audiences with live reporting across the country and reactions from the diaspora and from Washington on the interactive radio and TV program Live Talk. Interactive call-in shows remain one of the best ways to draw younger audiences, with the popular Portuguese program Angola Fala Show and the groundbreaking Kirundi program Murasanga, joining political rivals and local activists, all on Facebook Live. In arts and entertainment, VOA is on the scene with the French television show Vous et Nous, the Hausa music program Chasu, and the weekly Red Carpet program, targeting younger audiences in Portuguese and Swahili.
Vous êtes avec nous en direct de la Maison Blanche.
With first-hand reporting from the United States and frontline coverage from the continent, VOA reaches more than 68 million Africans every week.
Expensive it is. Just incidentally, I think the entire continent represents about 1.5 trillion in trading power, which puts it around 11th after Russia in the world. So we're going to transition into our first panel discussion. Our first panel discussion is on African history and civil society and developmental journalism. Our first speaker, we have a wonderful group assembled for you today. Our first speaker is Dr. Hamza Mwamoyo. Dr. Hamza has a doctorate in philosophy and a master's in mass communication and media studies from Howard University. He's the head of Swahili Service of Africa Division at the Voice of America. Swahili service broadcasts to East and Central Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. Dr. Hamza recently returned from a tour of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where he observed United Nations peacekeeping efforts in Eastern DRC, which has witnessed civil conflict for more than a decade now. We will take the time to introduce each speaker, and then they'll come up and give their spiel. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mwamoyo.
On that video, the VOA covers the whole continent, has broadcast in 45 languages in all. 16 of those are in the Africa division. In the 16 languages, we cover a number of issues from politics, social affairs, as well as conflicts. And of late, we seem to cover a lot of, conflict, but much about that later. Let me first throw some numbers to you to show how important the Voice of America is to our audiences. In all, the Voice of America has 200. These are figures from the latest survey, which was 2016, late 2016. So in all, Voice of America has 236 million listeners. Out of those, 68 from the African continent. So as you can see, the African continent has more listeners for VOA. Two languages, Hausa and Swahili, are among the top 5 at the VOA. Out of that, when we look at impact model, the data that shows impact model, which can be expressed in terms of the way people share information when they get it. The VOA Africa Division is all the way up there in the top list. Burundi at 89%, Somalia 81%, Liberia 70 cities of Kivu 61%, DR Congo now. Impact model on how VOA helps form opinions. This is people who ask, how, what they hear from or see on VOA, it helps them form their opinion about issues. Nigeria is 90.7%, Liberia 88%, Angola, Rwanda and Lubango only, this is 83%, Tanzania 80%, Burundi 79%, DR Congo national 76%. Trust model. How much do people, our listeners, trust information from the VOA? In Niger, Hausa service has 95.8%, Tanzania Swahili 94.6%, DR Congo Swahili 93.8%, Somalia 93.5%, Burundi, Kirundi, Kinyarwanda is 91.2%, and Nigeria Hausa 88.6%, DRC French to Africa 82%, and DRC Swahili 81%. So given this kind of data, you see that people believe what they hear from VOA, and it helps them sometimes form opinion, and we are well aware of that when we do our programming. So, as you know, since we're talking about democracy, elections can be arguably the most visible expression of democracy. And in that context, VOA Africa Division covers a lot of elections on the continent. Last year, we covered the Rwanda elections, presidential elections. Didn't make much noise, but there was an election in Rwanda about 4 days before the Kenyan elections, the first one. And then we covered the Kenyan elections, the first one in August, and then we covered the repeated elections in October. And we also covered the Liberia elections, which brought George Weah into power. So those were very important elections on the continent, and we were well covered with those. The calendar this year is full. There's a lot of elections going on in Africa on this year. But of course, Zimbabwe, they're having their general elections end of this month. Mnangagwa is trying to get elected into power. So we are already preparing. Our advanced team is already in the country. And then the most anticipated election this year would be the DRC elections, if it happens in December. So we are also Kivu, South Kivu, in the towns of Beni. We see how people are suffering in those areas. Those areas have been in conflict for many years. And UNESCO, which just got a new mandate in April, I think, from the United Nations, the conflict and make sure that there is peace in the Congo. We're covering the South Sudan conflict, as I think you're all aware how many times the people involved, the people in power, they have signed, peace agreements, and then the next day they will go and fight again. We're covering issues such as Al-Shabaab in Somalia and Kenya. We did a documentary on Boko Haram. With this documentary, we received some videotapes from the Boko Haram people, and we had like 83 hours of tape. So we had to send our people back to the area, trying to find out how genuine the tapes are, and go through them, and come up with an hour of a documentary. So it was a lot of work, but we think it was a very good presentation of how Boko Haram they conduct their business, and also we featured in big ways how other people are countering the Boko Haram campaign. At the moment, we are just about to send a team to northern Mozambique in Cabo Delgado area. If you are following the news, you've heard there's some attacks that are happening almost every other week, and people who are claiming to be inspired by Al-Shabaab. There are several theories coming out of that, whether it's really religious, or is it political or economic. So we're sending a team there so that we can cover the story and find out what's really happening. So I'll stop there, and then we can go on with the discussion. Thank you very much.
He has provided consultant services for universities, multinational corporations, and international development companies. And he advises in the areas of strategic planning, policy analysis, international relations, strategic leadership training, governance, capacity building, and political assessment. Guy Mohil Masamba holds a PhD in political science from Howard University and taught political theory at Howard University. Dr. Masamba is fluent in French and English. So, bienvenue, and if you would take the mic. Merci. Oh, please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
I said about me. I said the fact that I do consulting and I do some analysis for democracy with the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And sometimes I give courses on technology and political development in Africa with the University of Arizona, State University of Arizona online. That's a stay from my conference said. The topics of realism and idealism as theories of international relations. That's, as I thought it was kind of vague or vast, I decided to try to focus with the concept of Africa, how policies around the world, driven by either realism or idealism, have affected Africa in general. So we look at that, and also we also may have a say about African leaders themselves, how we can characterize them, either realistic. So my topic is about leading through the prism of realism and idealism. And we're going to be looking at the evolution of the international political system. And before that, I wanted to build a conceptual framework, which is going to bring some definitions of these two particular concepts. And this true perspective is tied to the analysis, the realities that are at play within the international conceptualization of international system are varied. We consider the state is one of those major components when we look at when we analyze international relations from the analysis of realism or idealism. The state and national interests also play a major role in affecting or impacting the policies of any country or any leader. And power and balance of power are also key factors. Another factor is the actors themselves. I mean, the leaders, those play a major role in influencing the political system. And agencies, diplomacy, globalization, democracy, human insurance society, norms, and international law. Again, these realities or these factors in a random. But you can also see which one of these factors allies most to these leaders who are realists or allies more to leaders who can consider idealists. For example, I would say the notion of state is very important for leaders who tend to be realists. Or the notion of national interests, power and balance of power, those are key concepts used by people or leaders who try to promote realistic views of international relations. Whereas when we consider the notion of human rights, culture and society, norms and international law, diplomacy, globalization, and democracy are also factors that are used or promoted by leaders who consider themselves to be idealists in general. And there could be also some gray areas, but in general we can characterize them that way. And this kind of conceptual framework can be also looked at when we see Africa. I'm tempted to bring Africa in this context from the historical point of view. When we see, for example, leaders who fought for independence in Africa, where do we put them? Do we put them in the category of realists, or do we put them in the category of idealists? Let me give you an example. These leaders when they fought for independence, for example, give Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, Yuru, even in South Africa, now we have a new system, but when Mandela was there, when he was fighting, why do we fight when we put these leaders? I was tempted to say, for example, if I consider these leaders to be promoting the notion of a state, the building of African states, they came up with the realist views because they thought that the national interest of these continents or this particular state are fighting for, which is the independence of the states. And within this context, we also see that they also used the notion of international law to promote independence because they thought that democracy or rights of the people were paramount. So it is very difficult to say to put them in one category because they fit, using these two concepts, they fit within these two realities or to these two theories because of the factors they promoted according to the needs of the population, according to the needs of African countries in the world, if any. So let me come to the definitions of these two terms as a realm of survival and conflicting interactions between states. So these are the two contexts from which we can define the theory of the school of thought, which is called realism. Now, the school of thought of idealism is based on a very important determinant, I would say, that can be used as a presupposition, which is the view that human nature is good, as opposed to the other theory that consider human nature to be in conflict with other things around us. So, as such, idealism is going to portend such key factors as individual rights, consent of the governed, religious pluralism, democracy and human rights, equal rights. Those are essential in the making, really in the making, conditioned by acts of national leaders. The international system is not built by itself, or states are not made by themselves. They are made by leaders who come up with views, who come up with theories of the way they see the world. And the nations interact in the international sphere in accordance with conflicting interests because they come with interests of themselves. Also, the mutually cooperating views, because they can also lead to established views, and I would like to go beyond these two notions because, in a certain way, these theories of international relations, I wouldn't say that they are they are in the past. They are still around us because we see leaders behaving in a certain way. They are determined by these views. But there is also another way of looking at the international relations, international system, and I bring here the notion of constructivism, which is insisting on the notion of social relations within the states, in the way that people react to each other, they interact with each other. There is a social dimension in the international system that we have to consider. So this is what I would say, I would place leadership in this context. For example, I'm thinking of President Obama. I would put him in this theory of called constructivism because he's one of people considering the interaction between social factors within the country or within countries. For example, when he brought here the youth movement, I would say that is part of the social construct that he's trying to create. So it also transcends the reality of rivalry between countries or between states. Leaders in Africa, I would say Mandela is one of those, And today we see new leaders emerging. For example, I would say I just talked with an ambassador from Togo. For example, there's in Togo, not the president himself, but there is a group of people who are trying to insist on reconstructing the country on the basis of the relationship between youth and the other sector of the economy. So this is one of the things that we consider to be important in building a new world, and Africa has to build on those new theories or new construction of the international system, namely the constructivism that is going to determine the way the world is being built now. Thank you very much.
Dr. Ochada Hannington is a professor at the University of Kansas, an African American study department. Unfortunately, I don't have the full bio, but you'll give us a full flavor of the measure of the intellectual that we have before us. What I was able to gather is it says Kenya. I was in Kenya, but I'd be, is that complete?
Where I come from?
Yes.
No.
But you will give us an opportunity. I'm so sorry we didn't have the full bio here. But please join me in welcoming Dr. Hannington. Thank you very much.
I have taught at Kenyatta University before coming to the US. Could help. My name is Hannington Ochoada. I am from Kenya, and I say that I got my undergraduate degree in education and my master's from Kenyatta University, where I taught African history for some time before coming to the US on a Fulbright scholarship, and I got my PhD from Indiana University. I teach at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. I have taught at Emporia College, Emporia University, Danville College, Marquette University, and Missouri State, African history. Now today, what I'm going to do is, I know that my brothers, both Hamza and Masamba, have spoken a lot about what I might touch on. But what I want to do is to see what history has to offer, especially in the process of governing Africa. Now, it's very important for us to know that history, sometimes we look at history and just look at it as the past, but our history actually has been either our undoing or has been that one that has shaped the way we govern our countries. And I want to say this starting from 1957, when Kwame Nkrumah becomes the president of the prime minister or the president of, and then later on the president of Ghana. He's going to shape everything else, and he's going to begin to see that Africans need to think as the United States of Africa. And that becomes our undoing, because now we begin to move as Africa, as one. We forget that we have little histories here and there that define us. And those little histories matter quite a lot, because then we begin to see authoritarianism that is going to take root, and that same authoritarianism is actually the authoritarianism that is going to take the shape is actually what is going to be Kwame Nkrumah's undoing in 1966. And we continue to begin to see. And so what does Pan-Africanism do here? One, we begin to see what we're calling African nationalism. And then we transfer it to Pan-Africanism. And when we transfer it to Pan-Africanism, we begin to look at history, our own backward history. Not backward in the sense that we are backward, but we look back into our own history and begin to only celebrate what we had in the past. And that takes over from 1960 to 1970. That's going to take over. And when that one takes over, it's going to be our undoing, because we're not going to criticize ourselves. We're not criticizing ourselves, we're celebrating our past. And then come 1970, we come in with this Guyanese, Walter Rodney. He comes in and he's beginning to think about how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And when he begins to come in with how Europe underdeveloped Africa, he comes in with a kind of proto-Marxist view of looking at all these things. We begin to see a lot of struggles. And some of the Africans who have been talking about celebrating our past are not comfortable with that, because now they begin to see as though we are selling ourselves to a devil. And this is going to be quite interesting. So the essence of me saying this is that, what then, my question to you, what then is the role of history in terms of helping us, in the way of helping us to rethink the whole democratic process? We begin to see that the 1960s, late 1960s, or mid 1960s, a lot of coups are taking place. By 1970, 74, we have almost half the countries in Africa have gone through coup d'etats, except a few. Tanzania is one of them. Kenya is another one. Is going to escape that. We are probably going to see a few, just a very few. You can talk of very few. Senegal is going to be one of them, and just a few of them that have not gone through this. So what is it that we can learn? The question to you is, and when you come up to ask a question, what is it that we can learn from Africa, African history, that would help us to rethink the whole democratization process? Now you begin to see others. Recently you had Mugabe had to be forced out. Why? Why was Mugabe forced out? Mugabe started on in April 1980. Some of us really loved him because we thought he was progressive. But all of a sudden he changed. We were at the table there talking about Libya. When Gaddafi started, he started well. What was the problem? So how can we learn from our own history? Did our forefathers help us, or did they make things worse for us? So the thing is, my whole thing has been is that we spend, as historians, we spend so much time celebrating the past instead of looking at the problems that we had. And that's where we need to go back. And I'm going to be very brief and just leave you with that so that you can have time to ask me questions about Pan-Africanism and how democracy has been brought down by ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Rodney, and he talked about the role that history could play, I believe, in the development of Africa. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Andrea Barron. Andrea Barron has been advocacy and outreach consultant at TASC, or TASSC, since November 2013. She works with torture survivors and friends of TASC to educate policymakers and broader American public about U.S. human rights policy toward countries where survivors have fled, and on issues affecting survivors in the U.S., such as the asylum backlog. Andrea also coordinates TASC Truth Speakers program. Before coming to TASC, Andrea was Senior Program Manager for Civic Engagement at the Washington Center for Internships and Academic Seminars, where she organized volunteer advocacy projects for college students, global women's rights, Israel-Palestinians peace. For many years, she has been an interfaith leader in Washington, D.C. area, focusing on Jewish-Muslim cooperation and combating Islamophobia. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Barron. Thank you very much.
Hi, so I just want to talk for a few minutes about TASC, and then I'll introduce our speaker. So TASC is the Torture, Abolition, and Survivors Support Coalition. We work with survivors of torture from all over the world, but over 90% of the survivors that we work with are from Africa, and we call them survivors of torture, not victims of torture, because we're about helping them survive and rebuild their lives in the United States once they arrive here. So we are used to working, we have many survivors from all over Africa, but especially from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Cameroon, other countries in West Africa, but also Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Congo-Brazzaville, Uganda, many, many countries. And we have 4 different departments. One is social services, and we're going to have our speaker, Morgan, who's going to talk in more detail about that. Another is psychological services. We have therapists who help our survivors not only with physical aspects of torture, but psychological torture, because once they come to this country, people can suffer the rest of their lives from the psychological effects of torture. We also have a legal department, so our survivors come here to apply for asylum. These are people who are mostly professionals in their countries, doing extremely well, but they stood up for freedom and democracy, and that's important in this conference. It's about democracy in Africa. These are people who took the ultimate risk to stand up for democracy by criticizing their governments, and they were brutally tortured for doing that. And so our lawyers help them apply for asylum here in the United States. I work with the advocacy department, and what we try to do is influence U.S. policy towards the countries where our survivors are from, mostly, but not exclusively from Africa. And we also have truth seekers, where our survivors go to different institutions, churches, synagogues, universities, hopefully mosques also, to talk about their experience as survivors of torture and, again, rebuilding their lives here in the United States. So right now I want to introduce Morgan Nabik-Gianni. Morgan has a Master's of Social Work, and she is in charge of clinical case management. She also, we're very, very proud of Morgan because she was just recognized as a distinguished alumna from the University of Maryland system in the summer of 2018 for all the work that she's done with refugees and asylum seekers. So I'm going to present Morgan, and she'll talk a little bit about what she does at TASC as a clinical case manager and about mental health issues affecting asylum seekers. Morgan?
So I'm looking over at this panel, and there are so many doctors that I feel like I now need to go back to grad school. So thanks, guys. No pressure. So as Andrea kind of already touched on, the reason that I'm here and that I sort of fit into this discussion is because I work with survivors of torture who were persecuted predominantly for political activism. So they were survivors of human rights abuses perpetrated by corrupt governments. So one of the things that I want to address today is not just case management, which is what I do, which is important, but also mental health. So I want to go back a little bit and talk a little more about our services. I know Andrea touched on them, but as far as our social services go, not only do we provide case management, we also have a workforce development program to help people find good employment. And as Andrea touched on, a lot of our survivors are actually professionals back in their countries. So doctorates, lawyers, what else we got? Journalists, IT professionals, engineers. So these are very well-educated people who came to the United States to stay alive. And so we want to help them get back into their professions. The other service that I really wanted to talk about is mental health services. So we have therapists that work on staff. We also partner with different organizations to offer psychiatric services. Andrea, you took some of my talking points. How many countries do we serve? You're terrible. So the 3 types of persecution that we see most often are political activism, survivors from the LGBT community who are persecuted because of their orientation, and survivors of female genital mutilation. The most common is political activism, and that's mostly from Ethiopia and Cameroon that we see that, but we do serve a lot of other countries. As far as mental health goes, with survivors of torture, we see a lot of nightmares, trouble sleeping, and if you've ever experienced that before, you know that that starts to become a cycle. So once you start having nightmares, you stop sleeping as well, so then you have less tolerance for stress. We kind of call that a stress window. So you start to get outside of your window of tolerance. And so once that happens, you start creating this cycle of I'm not sleeping well, I'm not able to handle stress, and so I'm having nightmares, and it just kind of continues. That can be greatly influenced by our survivors watching news late at night, and so they're keeping very tuned into what's going on back in their country and getting pulled into this feedback loop. People often feel symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, and depression, and so what we want to work on is helping to reduce those symptoms. Now, as you might know, there is a huge stigma around receiving mental health services in the African community, right? So kind of how do you combat that? How do you show that this is a valuable service that should be offered? So one of the things that we like to talk about is when we have survivors who used to be very involved in their community back home, had a lot of friends, and when they started to feel overwhelmed, they had people to reach out to talk to. And now they've come to the US kind of unexpectedly. They might not have a support system here. And so opening the door to say that therapy could be a nice way to start processing those things, just like you did back home in a safe space. It's also very helpful to acknowledge that therapy does not have to be a long-term solution. So you can meet with a therapist once or twice, very short term, in order to start working on some of those coping skills. So those are kind of the ways that we talk about mental health. And we also want to acknowledge, too, the cost-benefit of receiving mental health services. So particularly with medication, we see it can be a huge stigma to take sleeping pills to help you cope with your sleep so that you get out of that cycle. But there's a huge stigma around taking psychiatric medications. So not just looking at the potential of side effects of taking medication, but what are the side effects of not taking medication? So it's this whole larger system where we want to reduce stigma so that we can encourage people to function better here in the US so that they can continue to be active, they can continue going back into their fields and providing not just support here in the US and contributing to the United States, but then they're able to engage in things like activism with Andrea, so they're having an influence on the political system back in their own country as well. That's all I got.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So we'll have an opportunity to ask. There's some very important, actually some initial thoughts that have been put out there. We talk about, for example, Voice of America, and there seems to be a tremendous amount of penetration that has been made, given by the data in terms of the acceptability, the truth factor. I was heartened to hear that on an average, it's upwards around 85%. We talk about the 90% in places like Ethiopia, I think, around Nigeria, I heard was around 81%. And so I'll ask you to talk a little bit more about that. We talk about the issue of leadership in Africa, the role of our leaders, the framework of leadership, and we talk about the role that history can play. So the stage has been set for some very interesting questions. I want to see if we can we'll get some questions from our wonderful audience out there, but I'm going to take the prerogative of a moderator and pose a question. Across all the areas that you talk about, what is the role of leadership? What is the role of leadership in growth of the future Africa? If all the panelists could just address that issue maybe in about 1 minute or less, or if just one or two of you want to take it on, that's fine with me. So in terms of journalism, what is the role of leadership as far as, in that print media? In terms of public administration, so just let me know. We could go from left to right, or just raise your hand and please use
our history. But they use that history to benefit themselves instead of the masses, because it was about celebrating our past. Once you celebrate your past, you don't see any faults. And you say, okay, we had African chiefs, and these African chiefs, they did this, or these kings did this, and they helped. And so that's where you find that Mugabe grows out of being a very vibrant Pan-Africanist to becoming a dictator. It's the same thing you're going to find that Nkrumah starts off so well, but becomes that, which is unfortunate. And there's the rest of them. So that's, the leadership has to bring in the people themselves and begin to have that conversation. That conversation is not there. The conversation is among the leaders themselves, even today.
Yeah, I would second Ochoa on that, because in terms of we as journalists, when you look at the role of leadership in Africa, I think it cuts both ways. You have, especially coming, you know, where we come from as Africans, we tend to put our leaders up there. We respect them as elders. We respect them as people who can lead us to better, you know, days, a better future. So we give them a lot of leeway to lead us, to do things. Now the problem becomes when that leadership is turned into, you know, there's a saying nowadays, they say a leadership with a stomach. And that's when the conflict comes in. So leadership reaches a certain point where it's not given its due respect because of the behavior of the leaders themselves. So there's a very conflicting you know, idea about leadership in Africa right now, because people don't really trust leaders as they should, or as we hope leaders should be trusted.
Thank you.
I would like to answer the question by bringing the experience, particularly of those leaders who played a major role in leading the people of his country to a new era of South Africa. That is visionary leadership, at the same time practical, because he was able to know his role, his place, and after playing some major role in this country, he just said, okay, I did what I had to do and left. So that's a good leadership. I would say it's a very good example in terms of leadership. So we also have good leaders in Africa, Mandela said. And we had leaders who were very good in Africa during the time of independence. For example, Jomo Kenyatta or Kwame Nkrumah, despite what the change that he experienced because of the international reality. So those leaders played a major role, which was to lead, to create a vision of their country, at the same time guide the people into a new era of independence. So there is something that can be said about leadership in Africa from the experience that we have, both good and bad, but also I would like to insist on the role of leadership that is very positive for Africa for the future. Mandela is one of them who stand out of the crowd.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I want to mention also, here in the United States, we have a resurgence of people in the African diaspora who are taking leadership positions in trying to influence human rights and stopping torture in their countries of origin, who are very, very active in trying to influence U.S. policy, testifying before Congress. We've had Ethiopians testify before Congress, someone from Congo-Brazzaville, one of our torture survivors, also Eritreans who have submitted testimony to Congress, and people from many other African countries, along with the broader African diaspora that we're cooperating with. And so I just want to talk about this new resurgent leadership of Africans in this country, which is kind of new and very, very exciting, and who believe in a democratic leadership and want to promote democracy in their own countries.
Great. You know, that may be a good point to actually delve into a little bit more. As we watch democracy grow in Africa, what are the guideposts that we should actually be looking at? what are the standards that we should be evaluating our African leaders? Because there's a yin and yang to leadership as well. There's followership. But there's also different ways of evaluating in terms of not only the indices of growth and development, but also in terms of human rights issues, empowerment of women, education, mortality rates, all those different types of things. So I would just like to get some comments on, as we watch democracy grow, what are some of the signs that we should look at to see whether or not the countries are actually doing it right, that the leadership is actually doing it right?
On the last point, but as far as working with survivors of Haitian, survivors of torture, I think that it's so important that we definitely focus on human rights abuses. So you can't have a government say, oh, we're democratic, oh, we're doing so well, look at our economy, and then behind the scenes they're torturing their own citizens. So I think that's a standard that we have to put in place. And I love that Andrea pointed on kind of reframing what we mean by what we say is leadership, because I think we have to acknowledge that just because you're an asylum seeker or refugee, you've been forced to flee your country, doesn't mean that you can't continue to serve as a leader in your community and still in your country from outside of your country. So I think that's something that we need to make sure that we are acknowledging, that just because you've been forced to flee your country out of fear of further persecution doesn't mean that you can't continue to fight for human rights.
As pointers that we can look at, in terms of communication, we are really looking at participation, political participation. How much are people participating in the political process, in social affairs, women's affairs, youth affairs, and all that. Today, I was reading a story that Emerson Mnangagwa, who is the president of Zimbabwe and now running to get elected, he just opened a WhatsApp group, WhatsApp broadcast group. So what he is trying to do is, make sure that he can reach, people directly by just sending a message. Just as President Trump reaches a lot of people with the Twitter, his Twitter account. But at the same time, in Uganda, Museveni's government, last week, they just put a 200 shillings tax on every usage of social media. When you open up your social media, you go to Facebook, you have to pay 200 shillings a day. You go to WhatsApp, 200 shillings a day.
Give us an idea of how much US dollars.
200 shillings is about 5 cents.
5 cents.
So we made some calculations. In a month, Ugandan, if they go through all, social media platforms, they may have to spend about, $150. That's a lot of money. That is a lot of money just to be on the social media. So you look at how communication, how the social media has opened the political space and communication space in Africa. But at the same time, there are some efforts in different places to crack down on that space.
Absolutely. Let me just take it in. You then.
Yes, just
I got a question. That question.
Very quickly, I would just want to follow up on those things Professor said. One thing I would like to say is that democracy can also be judged by the way leaders open their societies to the world. For example, in the era of globalization, if the society is closed, it's not going to be able to open up the use of, for example, the people into the global system now. So if any society is to be called democracy, it has to be able to open up to the world today, of course, of the exchange of ideas that's going on, and the development of the society come from this interaction with the global system. Thank you, sir.
I don't know whether to react to this. So it's hard.
I saw you jumping out of your seat, but
Let me say one thing. You've talked about human rights. And how many concepts of human rights do we have? We have a Western concept and an African concept. And I would refer to Issa Shivji. Issa Shivji is a professor of law. I think he's retired now.
He's retired now.
At the University of Dar es Salaam. And he has been one of my mentors when I was growing up. And he came up with one thing, that the concept of human rights in the West is very different from our concept back in Africa. That human rights in Africa, in the West, is about me, and me. So even that democracy, the democracy is going to be centered around me and what I get out of it. But for us, the democracy is us. I'm your keeper. You are my keeper. And so that's how we go. So do we need to follow that? And when you're looking at the whole issue of development, whose development is that? Is that for the individual? And is that part of what the problem is, where you're having the leaders becoming extremely rich?
Yes.
Excessively rich, because they're looking at the Western democracy and the Western concept of human rights and the Western kind of development, that they forget the rest. I don't know, but again,
Well,
I leave that.
I'm going to go to the next question. I'm going to give you a pass on that because the cultural competency aspect of it is important. But what is the significance of the difference in the example that you just gave? And if it means violations of an individual rights, then do we do ourselves harm by embracing a concept that may be unique to us, but yet violates the individual rights? So I should have said on that. We have our brother from Ghana. You have from
these policies started in Africa. Nkrumah is
Mobutu?
No, not him. Modibo.
Modibo Keita.
And others. They concentrate on socialism and communism, and that appeal to a lot of people when you read it.
Yes.
But in practice, it's very difficult. Now, based upon what he said, the masses, the people, the minds are still on we the people. When they get to the scene where there are goodies and monies, it becomes mine. And they put the money they acquire from the state into foreign banks. The question I'm trying to raise is this. Now that socialism is dead, but in our minds have been implanted socialism. And in our communities are communalism. And when we get there, it becomes individualistic thing, and we start acquire money and putting them aside and not using it for the people. So once you become a leader, you become me, based upon what he's saying, and he's correct. But once you are not a leader, then it's we.
So I'm going to prompt you, my elder. Can you turn that into a question for our distinguished panelists here today?
Is me and we inconsistent in thinking of masses of people and how we interact?
Good question. Good question.
I don't think it is. Where Western democracy may not work in Africa, as much as we try, because we're still having to think that way. Look at this, and I'm going to put it this way very correctly, not correctly, but I want to put it the other way. When a leader is attacked, it is my community that's being attacked.
Yeah, that's right.
And why is that? Why do we have to go back when like Kenya? Now you go to Kenya when we had problems with the elections. You find that when Uhuru Kenyatta is attacked, the Kikuyus would say no. It is us being attacked. Why is that so? And how can we correct that? And this one I leave it to you.
The Kikuyus are just a part of the Kenyans. So are they all the Kenyans reacting when
No.
Okay, if all the Kenyans are not reacting, but only the tribal grouping,
Yes.
then you are talking about that the tribal politics predominates in Africa?
It's,
that's-
you can even reduce it, really get it out of tribal politics. Now go to clan. Go to clan and go to families. That's how it goes.
Ochoda, let me jump in there. I think, you know, you're quite right, and Sir, you're also quite right, because even our societies there, we have our own weaknesses also in there, in our systems. So when we speak of how do we go forward, we also have to address our own weaknesses. South Sudan is actually, I don't want to be disrespectful, but you know, you can look at it as a poster child of how not to do things. When South Sudan became independent, a new nation, 2010, 2011? 2011. The whole Africa was like, yes, now they have the whole continent to look at and see how not to do things. Because for 50 years, the African continent, countries who were independent, for 50 years, they've done a lot of mistakes. These guys, they had 50 years to look at them. So when they became independent, everybody thought, yeah, and they have oil too, so they have resources. So everybody thought, yeah, now they could, you know, get on that pedestal and jump higher and go very fast. And look what has happened. The role of leadership in democracy.
Well, I don't know if you want to make a point. I saw there's a question there, and then you, sir. Okay, 1 second. Apparently the gentleman there was first. You could either stand so that you could be heard fully, or you could just project your voice.
Thank you very much. People, they know what democracy is about. And they put it only one thing, that they have the right to choose who leads them. And they also have to usher a verdict on that performance, and they put somebody else. The problem in Africa about multi-party democracy has never been with the people. It was the governing class and the political class. Talk to me later on about 1967 elections in Sierra Leone.
Turn that into a question, if you would, sir.
Talk to me. They know what I said.
No, but I want you to challenge our panelists there.
I made a comment. They could challenge my hypothesis.
Anyone want to address, or we move to the next question?
I'll make a quick comment on that. So I work predominantly with activists who were fighting for democracy in their country, right? So that's a very good point. They know what democracy is. They know that they want to be able to choose their leaders. In Ethiopia in 2015, how did the EPRDF win every single seat that was up for election? That's insane. That's not democracy. They know it. And so they're standing up and saying, we've had enough of this. So I get your point, and I love it.
Speaking from a reporter's point, we reporters, we talk a lot. Speaking from a reporter's point of view, elections is a form of expression for democracy. Long before, we had one-party system in most African countries. And then they figured there's a lot of pressure from the people from the West, so they say, okay, we'll go to multi-party system. So they started multi-party system. But they found a way to, you know, to go around that multi-party system, yeah, to make it working for them, yeah. So now you have electoral commissions, which are actually, members are actually appointed by the president. So the president appoints members of the electoral commission, and you know, it's obviously when election time comes, they know their marching orders. So
let's correct that, though. They must be approved by Parliament.
Oh no.
Yeah, or
no,
the opposition.
in some places, yeah, but in other countries, no.
It's usually very contentious, but there are some provisos in there where I think there's some approval, or in fact, they must be recommended, I think, through some type of consensus along with the...
Kenya tried that last time, and it still didn't work.
Okay. I just want to make sure that we're accurate on that. But you're right. I mean,
it's not working well. Ghana is trying it. It's not working well.
yeah. Well, I can tell you that some presidents have tried to not even appoint the number of individuals on the Electoral Commission. Therefore, they were ruling by decree. You saw the way in the Caribbean of Michel Martelly, in fact. So it's a major stickler, I think, with our new democracies. But there's a question there by this handsome gentleman, if you would.
South Sudan. I would argue that anyone who had followed events in that country should not have been surprised by the chaos that now reigns. And this is an issue I covered over a decade's experience. And that the person who you could point to as the real father of South Sudan, Dr. John Garang, he was opposed to the independence of South Sudan. John Garang, a graduate of the University of Dar es Salaam.
Yes.
Yes. So now we have a situation where Mr. Salva Kiir and his supporters are saying that he should have 3 more years in power. So the question that I'm raising here, on the whole issue of independence, you have in Ethiopia a political construct that theoretically says that any of the nations or proto-nations in Ethiopia could opt for independence. This, I would argue, could be a prescription for disaster.
Chaos.
Because you had the Somalis and the Agaden who say, okay, I want to be independent. You had Oromo organizations who were fighting for independence with gun in hand. For me, the most important thing about democracy is people have to be consulted, people have to have a say in the process.
Turn that into a question now for the panelists as they prepare to make their closing statements.
The question I would ask is how, in the African context, can you reconcile the visions that exist within given countries?
It also has to do with how people are developing and how people are sharing the wealth. Without that, it can't be.
Yeah, I'm always tempted to go through the philosophical understanding of democracy, which has to consider the ontological fact, which is the human being. Because democracy is not only an institutional setting, it is because of the needs of the human being who is existing in a social reality. So, and I would say, to that end, I would say democracy has to be ethics. Democracy has to go hand in hand with ethics, because we cannot have a democracy if we don't have any moral consideration for anybody. Beyond the institutional characteristic of any political settings, there are always needs for building conditions for human beings to be happy in a certain society. That's what it is. At the root of anything that we consider democratic, it has to be considering the human at the center of that. If that fails, there's no longer a democratic system, I would say. It is also valid not only in Africa, even here in the US. We can also see that whenever we no longer consider the human being at the center of human society or human building, we are no longer a democratic society, I would say.
The professor here was so philosophical, it kind of threw me off. Yeah, but you know, I'm looking at this, as you say, I'm looking at this in terms of, you know, communication approach. And I think the political participation, open space, that's why having multiple parties is important. That's why having activism is extremely important, and it should be the space, the ground has to be free for people to participate in those kind of things. Discussions. Carter G. Woodson used to say, agitate. And you need that. In any society, you need that to have cohesion, to have exchange of ideas, and that's what will push democracy forward in all aspects, economic, philosophical, political, and all that. Let me say this, since you mentioned John Garang. I interviewed John Garang in a place called New Site. Just, I think it's like 10-minute plane, ride from Lokichogio in northern Kenya into Sudan. This is where they had their base when they were fighting. And I interviewed him a few months before they went back before the agreement in Naivasha. And he was very categorical that he doesn't want South Sudan to separate. And John Garang died in a plane crash. And that was a very suspicious plane crash. So you can tell there was something working, underneath for this man, a great man, an iconic man, to die like that. And, now you have the South Sudan that we have today.
Well, folks, we're going to wrap up with this first panel. You have about 30 seconds to make your closing remarks. If you would, we're going to start from my left, and then go on with a closing statement by Ms. Barton.
Yeah, I was talking about realism and idealism as two schools of thought in international relations, and also brought it into the context of Africa by looking at how leaders in Africa, according to what their leaning is, either in the side of the realist or idealist view, affected the international, the context of Africa by itself. And I used the leadership of Mandela as an example, with the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah and the leaders of the first African states in terms of independence. And my conclusion is that Africa has to be able to create a new type of leaders who look at the international system as a means of getting something good for Africa itself, not as a conflicting era, but also mostly as a way to learn from what is going on in the world, to learn from the mistakes of other states have made, and also to begin to consider bringing our own people into the realm of globalization in terms of development, I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank first WASH Democracy Grow for putting this together. It's it's a very noble thing to get together and discuss. My final thought, I would say, for democracy to grow in the continent, communication is very important. Communication is a natural thing for Africans. I'll give another example. Africans like to talk, but somehow, telephone companies didn't know that. So when the cell phone wave came, all the major phone companies in the world, they didn't think of going to Africa, because they said, they don't have the money, to own cell phones, and all that, And then there were some companies from Middle East, from India, who went into Africa and opened the telcos, and guess what happened? Text messages. each and every African woman, man has a phone. All they need is to text. They text from the farm, they text from the, when they come back from the city, they text when they're, So talking, speaking, exchanging ideas is huge in Africa. Don't clap on that, let it grow.
So I'm actually going to piggyback on that then. I love that. I like it when you guys set me up. So obviously I'm speaking from a mental health standpoint. Working here in the United States with asylum seekers, I've also worked with refugees and other survivors of forced migration. And I'm going to piggyback on here by saying communication is very important. So what we do is to help empower people so that they can find their voice again after they've fought for human rights in their own country, help them find their voice again here in the U.S., and then be able to use that voice for good, not just here, but back home in their countries. So if you guys have questions about kind of what TASK does or more about human rights, specifically working one-on-one, happy to answer those questions. But I think that that's an excellent point to continue communication with the diaspora here in the U.S.
Yeah, I'm going to be just brief. I was talking on history, the importance of history, and also touched on Pan-Africanism. There is, in my view, there is need. It's not just about this is Kenya, this is Tanzania, this is South Sudan, this is Northern Sudan, if you may call them, and they are doing their democracy. There's need for policing, to police each other, so that you come up, if a leader, if a Zimbabwean leader, for instance, has made a mistake, the other leaders should also be able to say, oh no, this is not right. But where you sit back and say, okay, that is Zimbabwean, that is Tanzania, that is Algerian, and we leave them to do their thing, it's not going to work. So we need some kind of policing. And that's the kind of Pan-Africanism that I would encourage.
Well, that's it. Ms. Barton, you're going to bring up the rear?
Yeah, I want to say a few words about criteria for democracy. And so just kind of summarizing what everyone else has said, the importance of elections and economic development and also individual human rights, like what we call the Bill of Rights freedoms in the United States, the freedom of assembly to join an opposition political party, the freedom to criticize the government and the press, and also individual rights for the LGBT community, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. That's a part of human rights. And also the right for women to be free to choose their own husband, their own partner, to be protected from domestic violence. Those are all individual rights. So I think we need all of these things. And finally, very, very important is what we call a democratic political culture, which means just being willing to listen to somebody with an opposing view. I'm very sorry to say that the United States is no longer a very good model for a democratic political culture. It's not. So we cannot look to the United States as an example of what that means. But I think that if you just have, elections and you have constitutions, things on paper, but you don't have this idea that I have to listen to someone else who has an opposing point of view and they have a right to their opinion, then you really can't have a real democracy. So, but we need to look toward other countries right now that provide a better example for that than the United States.
Well, on that note, please join me in thanking distinguished panelists. Yeah, let's watch democracy grow now. Thank you. Okay, folks, we'll be getting ready for the next panel. We're going to take a short